Hey guys, tonight we start in the fluorescent glow of a checkout aisle. You're holding a loaf of bread, a phone charger, maybe a frozen lasagna you're pretending is meal prepped. The scanner beeps, and the total flashes on screen. $112.89. You blink. How did a few groceries and a cord cost more than a date night? Well, some of that price isn't bread, cheese, or silicon, it's tax. But not the kind you voted on. This one came in through the back door, stamped into shipping containers, disguised in legalese. It's called a tariff, and you've already paid it. Surprise. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and what time you're watching. Are you a midnight thinker in Boston or a 6 a.m. wanderer in Jakarta? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through this economy every day, buying, working, trading time for money and money for goods. But most of the time, the rules behind those transactions are invisible. Tariffs? They're just one of the more devious ones. Think of them like financial ankle weights, tiny at first, but stack enough and you're running uphill through molasses. Let's say you buy a microwave for $150. But hidden in that price is a 20% tariff on imported steel, a 12% tariff on the electronics inside, and maybe a retaliatory fee because another country decided, well, two can play that game. You're not just heating leftovers, you're reheating decades of trade disputes. The U.S. consumer paid an estimated $57 billion in extra costs from tariffs imposed between 2018 and 2019. For the average household, that worked out to about $831 per year. That's not pocket change. That's a whole month of groceries, or 3 dentist appointments, or one suspiciously overpriced concert ticket to see a band that peaked in 2008. But here's the kicker. These tariffs are often billed as pro-American. We're protecting jobs, they say. But what jobs and at what cost? Because while a steelworker in Pennsylvania might benefit, the car plant in Tennessee that buys that steel at inflated prices might lay off workers just to keep margins tight. That's called an input-output linkage. But you'll probably feel it as, why did my cousin just lose his job at the transmission factory? Historians still argue whether consumers ever truly feel tariffs, or whether the anger always lands elsewhere. Maybe you curse the grocery store, maybe you switch brands, but you rarely think, ah yes, the Tariff Act of 1930 strikes again. And speaking of 1930, here's a quirky twist. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, infamous for worsening the Great Depression, was signed while Herbert Hoover's mustache was arguably the most competent thing in Washington. It raised tariffs on over 20,000 goods, triggering retaliatory tariffs from Canada and Europe. Global trade collapsed by 66%. That's not a typo. 66%. Still, the defenders will say, sure, you pay more, but it's worth it. It's like buying organic kale instead of regular spinach. You're not paying for taste, you're paying for principles. But where's the line between principled protection and economic self-harm? There's also the weird reality that tariffs often land hardest on the poor. Why? Because lower-income families spend a higher proportion of their earnings on goods, not services. You can skip a Netflix upgrade, but not baby formula. That makes tariffs regressive, like a tax that punishes you harder the less money you make. And here's your fringe tidbit of the night. In 1963, to protest a new German tariff on imported chicken, the U.S. retaliated with tariffs on brandy, potato starch, and Volkswagen vans. The chicken tax, as it's now called, still haunts U.S. automotive policy today, making it laughably hard for companies to import affordable foreign-made pickup trucks. Yes, tariffs can be born from chickens, and they never really die. So tonight, as you sip something warm or scroll absently through your feed, remember this. Every object around you, your earbuds, your hoodie, your couch, has crossed borders. It's been touched not just by hands and machines, but by policies, politics, and price tags invisibly padded by decisions made far from your local Walmart. You didn't choose the tariff life, but buddy, the tariff life sure chose you. You step into the pages of an economics textbook, except this one smells faintly of old coffee and political compromise. There, nestled between charts and cheerful supply and demand curves, is David Ricardo, the quiet British thinker who gave us the idea of comparative advantage. It's one of those economic theories that sounds so tidy you almost want to frame it. Every country, Ricardo said, should just do what it does best. Specialize. Trade. Everyone wins. World peace, free muffins, and infinite prosperity. Except, of course, you don't live in a textbook. Comparative advantage hinges on a few quaint assumptions. That everyone trades fairly, that labor can't move across borders, tell that to remote work, and that countries don't care about things like political leverage, military strength, or controlling semiconductor production. Take this. If the US specializes in designing software, and China specializes in manufacturing phones, it's all good until one day China decides to stop shipping those phones. Or worse, the chips inside them. Suddenly, your specialization feels less like efficiency and more like dependence. You reach into the modern world for proof. Costa Rica, for instance, leaned hard into medical device exports and rode that advantage to economic stability. Ghana, on the other hand, still exports raw cocoa beans cheaply and imports expensive chocolate bars. Same beans, different value. It's like planting diamonds and harvesting gravel. Historians still argue whether Ricardo's theory applies in a world where intellectual property theft, currency manipulation, and state-owned enterprises warp the game. And yet, policymakers continue to cling to it, sometimes because it's elegant, sometimes because it's convenient. Free trade makes GDP go up, and who doesn't like graphs that point skyward? But here's your quirky twist tonight. In the mid-1800s, Portugal had a comparative advantage in wine. Britain made cloth. So under Ricardo's logic, Portugal should export wine, import cloth, and everyone would toast with cheaper booze and fancier coats. Problem is, Portugal started depending heavily on British imports and found its own textile sector floundering. Domestic industries collapsed. Wine flowed, but jobs didn't. Now fast forward, that tension is everywhere. In 2023, the US still imports over 90% of its rare earth elements, materials essential for everything from missiles to iPhones, mostly from China. Comparative advantage says, no worries, just trade. Strategic planners, meanwhile, are sweating bullets. And then there's the cultural layer. Economists love to reduce things to numbers. But try telling a local farmer that their livelihood should disappear because their country isn't comparatively advantaged. You may as well tell a chef to stop cooking because frozen pizza is more cost-effective. But there is a genuine tension here. Free trade does work in many cases. Countries that embrace it tend to grow faster, innovate more, and offer cheaper goods to their citizens. South Korea's meteoric rise came not from hiding behind walls, but from eventually opening up after a period of clever, well-managed protectionism. So what's the problem? It's that comparative advantage assumes a level playing field, but the real world tilts. Nations subsidize, manipulate, and undercut. And when one country plays dirty, the others either retaliate or risk being turned into customers instead of competitors. There's even a meme-worthy moment in 2018 when an economist on TV defended outsourcing US manufacturing to other nations, saying, "Let them make the stuff. We'll just do the thinking." Which sounds cute until you realize that thinking doesn't build bridges, power grids, or PPE in a pandemic. And here's your reality check. If your country loses the ability to make basic things, steel, medicine, energy, no amount of theoretical advantage matters when supply chains snap. So tonight, you sit in that tension. Between Ricardo's dream and a strategist's nightmare. Between trusting the market and guarding your future. Between ordering another smartphone and wondering if one day you'll no longer know how to make it. Your takeaway isn't simple. Trade can build peace or dependence. Specialization can drive wealth or fragility. And comparative advantage is still a brilliant idea, just maybe not a perfect one. You shuffle into history's cluttered attic, where dusty policies sit beside ruined economies, and someone forgot to turn off the panic alarm. Tonight, you meet tariffs done wrong. Not just wrong like, oops, we miscalculated, but wrong like, we tanked the global economy and set fire to our own dinner table. Let's begin with a name that sounds more like a vaudeville act than a legislative disaster. Smoot-Hawley. signed in 1930, just as the Great Depression began its descent. This well-meaning mess was designed to protect American farmers and industries from a world spiraling out of control. It raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods. That's not a typo. Imagine taxing everything from Swiss watches to Peruvian alpacas. At first, politicians clapped themselves on the back. "We're saving American jobs," they cheered. Then Canada, France, Britain, and a long line of trade partners said, "Oh, really?" and hit back with tariffs of their own. Exports plunged. Trade collapsed. Global commerce shrank by a bone-cracking 66% within just a few years. And millions more jobs were lost than saved. Historians still argue whether Smoot-Hawley caused the Depression to deepen, or whether it just made the medicine taste worse. But one thing's certain. It was economic CPR with a sledgehammer. Want a fringe tidbit? One of the earliest international protests of Smoot-Hawley came not from a diplomat, but from Ernest Hemingway, who sent a mocking letter accusing Congress of knowing more about fishing lures than foreign trade. He wasn't wrong, but let's not give America all the credit for tariff-based blunders. Jump across the Atlantic to Britain's Corn Laws, enacted in 1815. Designed to protect domestic grain prices by slapping tariffs on cheap imported food, they ended up doing something else, making bread too expensive for the working class to afford. Riots broke out. Protesters hurled flour at Parliament. And politicians eventually backed down in 1846, not because of principle, but because the people were quite literally hungry for change. Fast forward to modern Argentina, where protective tariffs aimed at fostering local manufacturing have instead led to what economists delicately call chronic underperformance. In real terms, the country builds outdated cars, relies heavily on imports anyway, and battles recurring inflation as industries grow fat and sleepy behind high walls. You see a pattern forming: intentions versus outcomes. Tariffs often arrive as knights in shining armor, but end up crashing the wedding, spilling red wine on the bride's dress. But defenders argue, those were extreme cases. Maybe, but even in recent times, the script repeats. In 2018, the US imposed steel and aluminum tariffs. Domestic production ticked up, but so did prices. For every steel job saved, studies estimate 75,000 other jobs were affected negatively, from beer cans to auto parts. One aluminum buyer described the cost spike as being mugged by patriotism. And don't forget retaliation. China answered back with their own tariffs, especially on US agricultural products. American farmers lost $20 billion in exports practically overnight. The government responded with subsidies, but many family farms never recovered. Here's the real kicker. If you're a small business relying on imported parts, tariffs don't just cost more. They can kill your entire product line. You either raise prices and lose customers, or you eat the cost and hope your margins don't vanish. So what's the lesson? Tariffs are powerful. But like giving caffeine to a toddler, power without precision can wreck everything in sight. They aren't inherently bad, but they require timing, targeting, and restraint. A blunt instrument becomes a bludgeon if used with pride instead of caution. Yet, oddly, the more destructive a tariff becomes, the more stubbornly politicians defend it. Why? Because admitting economic pain is their fault feels like electoral suicide. So they spin, reframe, and insist it's part of a necessary adjustment. A fancy way of saying, let's just wait and see who suffers first. You sit back now, watching this theater unfold. Economic nationalism is an easy sell. Wrapped in flags, forged in speeches, but it often forgets the backstage crew. The supply chains, the exporters, the silent gears that keep things moving. Next time someone says, we need tariffs to save American jobs, ask them which jobs, and which jobs they're willing to lose in return. Because history remembers the times we taxed our way into oblivion. It just doesn't always put them on the front page. You stroll past a nursery of industries, not literal ones with rattles and lullabies, but economic infants, dressed in blueprints and spreadsheets, crying for protection. Tonight's tale? The seductive logic of the infant industry argument, a theory that says some businesses just need a little time, a little shelter, and a loving tariff or two to grow up strong. You've heard it before. How How can a newborn factory in Ohio compete with a steel giant in Shanghai? Just give it some breathing room. It sounds reasonable. Just like training wheels, tariffs are supposed to come off once the kid can ride. Only, what if the training wheels never come off? Let's rewind to the 19th century, where Alexander Hamilton, yes, that Hamilton, was one of the earliest champions of infant industry protection. He believed that a young America shouldn't stay dependent on British imports forever. So he proposed tariffs to shield American manufacturers while they found their feet. It worked, sort of. By the late 1800s, the US was an industrial powerhouse. But the tariffs didn't vanish. They morphed into habit. Historians still argue whether America's rise was because of Hamilton's vision or despite it. Now jump to South Korea after the Korean War. A devastated, agrarian economy. The government implemented tariffs to protect domestic industries like steel and electronics, then followed with aggressive export incentives, technology transfers, and strict benchmarks. Within decades, Hyundai and Samsung weren't infants, they were titans. Here, the protectionism had a clear plan and an expiration date. Compare that to India's auto industry in the late 20th century. Protected by towering tariffs, local manufacturers like Hindustan Motors produced the same boxy, underpowered ambassador car for decades. It became a national icon and a mechanical relic. No pressure to innovate, no real competition, just rust, complacency, and a false sense of independence. The key difference? South Korea treated its industries like students. India treated them like royal heirs. And here's a quirky tidbit. In Brazil during the 1980s, tech companies were shielded so aggressively from foreign competition that they ended up building their own computers. The result? Machines that cost twice as much and did half as much. Protection, in this case, was more like house arrest. So why do governments keep falling for it? Because the idea of nurturing something domestic feels good. It's patriotic. It sells. And in some cases, when paired with performance goals and sunset clauses, it actually works. But more often, tariffs linger like bad roommates. They eat your food, raise your bills, and never wash a single dish. Economists call this rent-seeking behavior. It's when protected industries spend more energy lobbying the government to keep protections than they do improving their products. It's cheaper to cozy up to a minister than it is to redesign your widget. You know the feeling. You've seen that one company with a monopoly license that never upgrades, never answers emails, and always blames the customer. Now imagine that at a national scale. And here's the trap. Once a tariff is in place, removing it becomes politically toxic. Politicians fear being labeled anti-worker, unions rally, and suddenly a 3-year protection plan stretches into a 30-year legacy. So tonight, you walk between two truths. Yes, infant industries exist. Yes, some deserve protection. But they also need rules, milestones, evaluations, and firm weaning dates. Otherwise, we end up with an economy full of overgrown toddlers demanding government snacks. Think of it like a greenhouse. It's meant to help seedlings sprout, not to grow an entire forest under glass. And before we move on, a moment of empathy. Many of these protected firms aren't lazy or malicious. They're stuck in systems that reward survival over excellence. They're told, just hold the line, instead of race to the top. And over time, their ability to compete fades, not because they lack talent, but because they lacked pressure. So tonight, as you sip your tea or let the hum of the room settle, ask yourself this. Is protection really love? Or just fear dressed up as safety? You wake to a strange silence, the kind that fills a grocery store aisle when the shelves are bare. No toilet paper.
No batteries. No surgical masks.
It's not a memory. It's a headline you lived through. Because when crisis hits, supply chains shiver, and suddenly, everyone's asking the same question. Why don't we make this ourselves? That's when tariffs come back in style, not as economic policy, but as emergency armor. The argument is blunt and urgent. Some industries are simply too important to leave to foreign powers. Not because of price, not because of profit, but because of survival. And it's not just pandemics. You zoom out to a world of cyber attacks, rising tensions, and militarized trade. The stakes are higher now. Microchips are the new oil. Satellites aren't just for TV anymore, they're targets. And a nation that can't make its own antibiotics or drones is a nation playing defense. Enter the national security tariff, a tool once used sparingly, now increasingly wielded in tech wars and energy showdowns. Think steel, semiconductors, solar panels. These aren't just products. They're puzzle pieces of autonomy. Historians still argue whether security-based protectionism is wise foresight or panic in a suit. Some say it's essential. Others call it fear economics. Here's your quirky nugget for the night. In 1983, the US placed a temporary tariff on Japanese motorcycles, specifically to save Harley-Davidson from collapse. Critics scoffed it was just a brand, not a critical sector. But that just a brand held thousands of jobs and a symbol of American grit. Harley rebounded, the tariffs phased out, and the company survived. Was it national security or national nostalgia? Now leap to 2023. The US CHIPS and Science Act rolls out to bring semiconductor manufacturing back home. The logic: if China invades Taiwan, home to the world's most advanced chip makers, it won't just be TikTok you lose. It'll be your phone, car, military radar, and toaster oven. Not necessarily in that order. But here's the catch. Building self-reliance isn't cheap. Domestic fabs cost billions and take years to become operational. Tariffs can buy you time, but not certainty. And if not paired with investment, education, and innovation, they're just expensive band-aids. Still, some level of redundancy makes sense. COVID showed us how fragile global sourcing really is. When masks ran out, countries banned exports.
Planes sat grounded.
Even the mighty Amazon couldn't fulfill demand. That's when the public shifted from free trade is great to where the heck is my Tylenol? Strategists call this economic resilience. You might call it sleeping better at night. But security tariffs come with moral gray zones. Which industries are essential? Who decides? Steel? Sure. Antibiotics? Of course. But what about fertilizer? Lithium? Rare earth magnets? The list grows faster than your grocery bill. And what if every country thinks this way? You get deglobalization, a world of walled gardens and hoarded tech. Fewer partnerships, more tension. Protection leads to retaliation. And suddenly, the same policy that was meant to protect your supply chains starts strangling them. You're caught in a loop. Protect your own trigger, a response, increase scarcity, double down on protection. It's like barricading your house so well that even your pizza delivery can't get through. Still, it's hard to argue against caution. You don't build fire exits after the blaze. You build them because one day it might come. And there's another layer: psychological security. In uncertain times, people like the idea of made in America, not just for economic reasons, but emotional ones. It feels safer to think that your medicine, your phone, your internet didn't cross an ocean to reach you. But tonight, you're not asked to pick a side. You're just here to notice the trade-off. Because every mask made locally costs more. Every chip sourced domestically raises the price. Every act of control nudges the market a little further from efficiency and a little closer to stability. So ask yourself, when the lights flicker, when the ship stops sailing, when the news anchor starts using words like disruption and dependency, what's that worth to you? You lean in closer to the machinery of modern trade, a sprawling network of gears and belts invisible to most but humming beneath everything you own. It's called the global supply chain, and it's delicate. One misplaced tariff can set off a chain reaction that brings factories to their knees and leaves shelves bare. Imagine a steel tariff slapped on imports. At first glance, it's a win for American steelworkers. But here's the twist. The factories that build cars, refrigerators, and airplanes need that steel too. The price spike doesn't just hit steel producers, it ripples downstream. Suddenly, the car manufacturer has higher costs and is forced to cut jobs or raise prices. This domino effect, economists call input-output linkages. Sounds technical, but it's really the butterfly effect in your backyard. In 2018, when the US imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum, studies estimated the policy led to 75,000 fewer jobs in downstream industries. So, while steel jobs gained ground, more jobs were lost where steel was an ingredient rather than the headline. It's like cheering for the quarterback but forgetting the linemen who make the play possible. Historians still debate how to measure these indirect impacts, but the human stories are undeniable. Small manufacturers reliant on imported parts found themselves caught in a vice, forced to choose between passing costs to customers or bleeding margins. Here's a quirky fact. Japan, after World War II, used a tariff strategy that protected finished goods like electronics but allowed duty-free imports of key components. This helped build competitive industries without crippling their supply chains. A model many economists praise but few countries replicate fully. Today, consider your smartphone, a marvel assembled from parts sourced worldwide. A tariff on semiconductors doesn't just raise the chip's price. It inflates the cost of your entire device. Innovation slows, prices rise, and consumers pay the tab. Some say global value chains are outdated in a world of rising nationalism. Others argue that their complexity makes tariffs a blunt and costly tool in the modern economy. It's a debate with no easy answers. So, as you use your phone or open that box of cereal, remember, the price you pay reflects not just manufacturing costs, but intricate webs of trade policies, tariffs, and retaliations. And that, dear viewer, is the hidden cost of protection. You step into the high-stakes arena of global commerce where governments don the armor of tariffs and subsidies, waging silent wars for market dominance. This is the world of strategic trade theory, where tariffs aren't just taxes, they're calculated moves in a geopolitical chess game. Consider the legendary rivalry between Boeing and Airbus. Both companies have soared to global prominence, but not without government support shaping their fates. European nations backed Airbus with hefty subsidies, while the US responded with tariffs and defense contracts to keep Boeing competitive. These battles aren't just about planes. They're about jobs, technology, and national pride. But strategy cuts both ways. South Korea's tariffs in the 1980s helped Hyundai and Kia grow from local oddities into global car brands. These protections bought time, allowed investment in technology, and created economies of scale. The result? Brands recognizable worldwide, supporting millions of jobs. Yet not every strategic tariff wins. The solar panel industry in Europe and the US faced stiff competition from China's subsidized manufacturers. Despite tariffs and anti-dumping measures, domestic producers struggled, leading to lost investments and higher prices for consumers. Historians still debate if these tariff wars foster innovation or just fuel rent-seeking and political posturing. Strategic trade theory assumes governments can pick winners, but history shows they often back the wrong horses, wasting resources and alienating trade partners. The quirky side? Sometimes these battles lead to absurd outcomes. In 2019, a tariff dispute threatened to hit French cheese and American whiskey simultaneously. Two products unlikely to be enemies, but caught in the crossfire. The cheese war was as much about politics as economics. So you ask, is tariff warfare clever strategy or a costly gamble? The answer lies somewhere in between, in a game where winning means both economic power and diplomatic finesse. You dive into the tangled web of economic complexity, where nations don't just build products, they weave entire ecosystems of innovation and industry. Tonight, you're exploring whether tariffs help countries leapfrog into modern economies or trap them in outdated cycles. The Harvard Atlas of Economic Complexity teaches us that countries thriving long-term diversify their industries, creating interconnected networks of skills and products. Germany's chemical industry in the 19th century blossomed behind protective tariffs, laying foundations that still pay dividends. Similarly, Ethiopia's use of tariffs on imported clothing helped its domestic textile sector grow by 50% between 2015 and 2019. But beware the trap of path dependence. When tariffs protect old industries, they risk locking a country into economic stagnation. Argentina's 20th century heavy tariffs shielded local manufacturers but discouraged innovation, leaving the economy brittle and reliant on outdated technologies. Singapore offers a contrasting story, a beacon of adaptability with minimal tariffs and open trade policies, relying instead on education and infrastructure to climb the complexity ladder. Historians still debate if tariffs nurture complexity or hinder it. The answer depends on how well protection is managed, paired with investment in skills and innovation. Your quirky tidbit? In 18th century Britain, the Navigation Acts protected shipping but arguably delayed the development of more advanced manufacturing, showing that even protective policies can have unintended consequences. Tonight, you see economic complexity as a dance. Tariffs can provide rhythm, but too heavy a step leads to a stumble. You step into the fiscal chamber, where tariffs have long jingled the coin purses of governments. Historically, before the rise of income taxes, tariffs were a major source of revenue, funding roads, railways, and nation-building projects. The U.S. government once depended on them for up to 90% of its income, a robust piggy bank that helped turn a young country into a global powerhouse. But the times have changed. Modern economies now favor value-added taxes, VAT, or income taxes, which are more efficient and less distortive. VAT spread the tax burden evenly across consumption, regardless of origin, unlike tariffs that target imports and risk provoking retaliation. Economists warn of the deadweight loss caused by tariffs, economic inefficiency where trade that would have been mutually beneficial is simply killed off. This inefficiency often outweighs any revenue gains. Latin American countries in the 20th century, with high tariff regimes, saw slowed growth and stagnation as a result. Yet some developing countries still rely heavily on tariff revenue. India, for example, has used tariffs to fund infrastructure investments, aiming to bootstrap broader economic growth. The debate remains: are tariffs a practical fiscal tool, or a shrinking pie sliced too thin? Some argue tariffs distort the market too much, while others see them as a necessary evil in certain contexts. Here's a quirky fact: the famous Smoot-Hawley tariff, while disastrous economically, did generate a brief surge in federal revenue, showing the short-term allure of protectionism. Tonight, you're left weighing the revenue streams against economic costs, deciding if the financial pump of tariffs is worth the economic leak. You arrive at the final crossroads, where logic battles legacy and 15 AI judges weigh in on the age-old tariff debate. Across vast data sets, historic records, and economic models, their verdicts weave a tapestry of insight and contradiction. Some judges, like Claude, see free trade as the clear victor, citing how protectionism breeds rent-seeking, innovation stagnation, and deadweight losses. Others, like Grok, acknowledge tariffs' strategic value in national security and economic sovereignty, urging a nuanced approach. The majority lean toward free trade, persuaded by historical failures like Smoot-Hawley and data on consumer costs. Yet the minority caution that ignoring geopolitical realities risks hollowing out vital industries and jeopardizing long-term resilience. Historians still argue whether any single model can capture this debate's complexity. The truth lies in balancing openness with strategic protection, a dance requiring vigilance, flexibility, and humility. You, the viewer, stand at the threshold. Which side will you champion? The invisible hand of the market or the protective shield of the tariff? Your choice matters for the jobs saved, the prices paid, and the future built. As the digital gavel falls, remember, tariffs are more than numbers. They're stories of people, power, and possibility. Now, as the noise of debate softens and the weight of information settles, breathe in the quiet complexity of it all. Trade policies are not mere economics. They ripple through daily lives, shape communities, and reflect our shared hopes and fears. Imagine the hum of factories, the chatter of marketplaces, and the pulse of innovation, each thread woven by choices made long before you held your wallet. Whether tariffs rise or fall, the story continues, with you as both spectator and participant. So rest easy tonight, knowing that understanding is the first step to wiser decisions, and that every economic debate carries the heartbeat of human resilience. Good night, and may your dreams be as rich and intricate as the global web we've explored together.